Right. Okay, so yeah, let's get to the subject of the day, which is marketing boards. Before then, something's making one.
No,
Yeah.
You don't say. How did you guys pick that? How did you pick that up?
Is it me that now?
Yeah, I'm clearly now.
This microphone sharp be that though.
That's
you did peel carrot for there.
They scratch bottom of ice cream bowl.
Hello?
That's better now.
See my microphone. Where are they down?
You don't already you see yourself.
Oh my god.
My micro. But you know, the first time we were talking, it was on. But
where do you come up with this stuff? It gonna be fun. I mean,
that fan is older than many people.
Yeah.
Nice MC.
I don't even know it.
Okay, DK.
SMT.
Nice MC, Abi.
SMT.
Nice MC. If no be SMC, na KDK.
SMT, bro.
SMT. Okay.
So for a while, we've been meaning to record an episode on the subject of marketing boards, which I think had come up, sort of as a veiled reference in our previous conversations, but became a more overt subject of interest and discussion in the course of our reading group, where we actually had a session on the colonial economy, in which marketing boards were quite central. So I think we'll have a bit of a historical conversation and then also reflect a little bit about economics in a sense, right? Or maybe you could call it socialist economics, because I want to think about the role of the peasantry versus large-scale agriculture and how to imagine possible futures based on the history of marketing boards in Nigeria. But before that conversation commences properly, I think it's probably good that we establish a bit of context, like what are marketing boards, where did they come from? I think I'll just say briefly before I hand over to others that, marketing boards were an institution set up by the colonial state to have a monopoly over certain crops that Nigerian farmers were producing. And these crops would be familiar to anyone who's got a basic understanding of Nigerian history: cocoa, palm oil, and peanuts, which were produced respectively in the southwest, the south, what is now the southeast and south-south, and the north, and were being sold on the world market and were the main source of revenue for governments in Nigeria prior to the emergence of oil. So the significance of marketing boards is that the government, the colonial government, and then after it, the independent regional governments were using these institutions to buy these commodities at prices set by the government and then sell them at the world market price, and that way raise revenue. So that's what we're talking about today. And we thought this is an interesting conversation to have because it sheds an important light on the foundations of the Nigerian economy, you could say, but then also has a historical value, and I think begins to shed more of a light on the emergence of what we've been calling the Nigerian scam. So I think that it's a good idea to cover this, and there's a lot that can be gained from it. Before we dive into the historical bits, maybe it's worth setting a bit of a theoretical backdrop to some extent. So I want to come to OAG first, and then hand over the mic to Emeka to give us a bit of history. But OAG, from your perspective, I mean, what is the value of trying to understand these marketing boards as institutions? So what do you think they tell us, about the nature of class relations in Nigeria? I just want you to respond from a kind of high level sort of brief summary of why you think it's worth having a conversation about these institutions.
Yeah, if you look at the political economy of like colonial countries, you see that even for the colonial guys that came in, they are here for a certain resource in your country, and facilitation or being able to facilitate access, unhindered access to those resources is what keeps the entire, global capitalist framework going, and which has a name like globalization in this new world that we're inside of now, So
Right.
that marketing board in itself is an attempt to structure or arrange colonial or neo-colonial economies in such a way that thread or that flow of access to resource doesn't get broken, even after they've removed their colonial hands from the picture, or if it was, coming that they were going to go away from there, So that's to ensure that the flow of groundnuts or peanuts, the flow of cocoa to wherever respective markets it was going to in the international community doesn't get stopped based on, if you're still finding your foot as a new nation. Just ensure that these things come onto the world market at prices that favor us. And then we can now do whatever it is that we want to do in our own central or in the center of imperialism or advanced countries. So it's a way of just herding, formerly colonial countries into the production pipeline and ensuring that they have continued access to those resources. So they'll set up those boards, and however you want to, the constitution of those boards inside of your country, focusing on class relations, focusing on peasants, focusing on all these things, it's left for you to determine and arrange, though they might still have a huge influence on it, but the ultimate goal is to ensure and facilitate the continued access of raw materials. That's just in that context.
Right. I think that's a really good kind of overview and background that allows us then dive into the specifics of history. And for this, I want to turn to Emeka initially. And so OAG is kind of talking about the way in which the colonies fit into the metropolitan economy and the way in which the colonies supported empire, right? And it kind of sets that context for the emergence of marketing boards. Emeka, is there more you want to add there? Like, why did the colonial states, in effect, pursue this policy of buying up agricultural produce from smallholder farmers?
Yes, sir. What more can I add? Yeah, so I think if I heard OG correctly in terms of providing a theoretical background for the conversation around marketing, but what he tries to do is situate that time.
Right, Megan, be like say you did far somehow.
Can you hear me now?
Better.
Yeah, so he tries to situate that time period within, events around time, what we might call the peripheral economy into, mainstay capitalist
centers, multiple.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I guess what I might want to add is that, there was a trigger for this, that the trigger
right.
would have been from the time of the Great Depression right into, from about during the Great Depression, but shortly before or just about when you had the Second World War. So this time frame would be from the late 20s to about the early 40s. So, but and these things were set up by, of course, in the case of Nigeria, Great Britain, which was the colonial power at the time.
Yeah.
It's also noteworthy to note that around the time when these things became staple within the Nigerian political economy, the USA had just started to become a dominant world force, right, and was battling Great Britain for trade, and because Great Britain was coming off both the Great Depression and the wars that they had gotten into during the Second World War. They had trade deficits with the US, so setting up marketing boards under whatever pretext that they claimed was a way of I don't think the word I'm looking for is ameliorating, but basically as a way to buffer that deficit. So they were. It was always going to be an exploitative relationship where surplus was extracted from the colonies, Nigeria being one of them, to augment for the trade deficit that they had incurred with the US, which meant that at the heart of marketing boards had to be the component of price fixing. So I guess I mean that sets a tone, to connect, OAG's theoretical grounding of the rationale behind marketing boards with the impetus itself.
Yeah, I agree, and I think those are kind of complementary points that paint two sides of the picture. Because on one hand, OAG is talking about the commodities themselves and how the commodities were feeding the industrial process in the metropole, right? And Emeka, you were talking about the revenue from the sale of those commodities by the monopolies that were operated either by the colonial state or by these charter companies. So you could say that the colonial state was benefiting on two fronts. The one that OAG is described, which is access to these raw materials, and the one that you are describing, which is the revenue from the sale of these raw materials, or the taxation, in effect, of the peasantry that generated revenue on these raw materials. I think the fascinating bit for me, and I think this is kind of important background that we should come back to in the second part of the conversation, is that this taxation was happening on the backs of ordinary, quote unquote, peasant farmers. Like, in other words, peasant farmers in what is now Nigeria were generating enough revenue to power a part of the colonial enterprise. Why that's so striking to me is that we, and even us on the left, often think of peasants as a kind of backward holdover, right? From a prior stage of history that need to be replaced by more productive or more efficient methods of organizing agriculture. And this has led to projects like collectivization in the countryside, or projects like large-scale plantation agriculture. But in this context, it looks like rather than trying to make those transitions, the colonial state in the onset and then the regional Nigerian governments after independence thought that it was fine to just leave the peasant agriculture at the level it was, so insofar as you could actually generate revenue from it. Which raises a question: is it that peasants are actually productive enough to form the basis of a growing economy? Or is it just that the colonial state was doing the easiest thing, and was in effect keeping people backwards, quote unquote, because it didn't want to actually trigger or invest in more, quote unquote, modern or efficient approaches to agriculture. So this is maybe somewhat provocative, but I'm really curious as to how you guys would respond to that. Thinking OAG should probably go first. Like, how do you read the fact that this economic system was built on the backs of peasant farmers rather than other kinds of agriculture?
I just feel that it's two of those things, or it's both of those things that you mentioned, because nobody wants you to add any value to whatever primary produce. That's the colonial guys. They don't want you to add any form of value, any added value, because that's what they go do in their country and sell back to you in terms of finished goods and products, And then again, it's not in their best interest to reorganize agriculture for you. So it's part of a colonial policy to stagnate and preserve backwardness, to ensure that's when you're more malleable and more vulnerable to exploits, so you're putting in so much work. And then the modernization that's happening to your own, the modernization that should have happened or that might happen to your agriculture or farming processes would lead you ultimately to that value adding. And they don't want that, So access to cheap raw materials, again, is very, very important for them, and they don't want to jeopardize that. So when they start engaging in other forms of improvement of agriculture or arranging it for you, then ultimately it doesn't coexist. Like, it's mutually exclusive to their own companies or whatever it is that they have in the center going on.
Right.
Because then we start modernizing agriculture, we start doing these things ourselves, we start catering to the needs of the people. And if by mistake you have a government that focuses on, catering for the people first and not focusing on cash crops, then that might be a problem, So it depends on the policy at that point in time, for colonial powers, is to preserve those modes of operation, forms of doing agriculture, and doing the easiest thing. It's the same thing with crude oil and flaring of gas and all these things. They will preserve the most outmoded forms of production as long as they get the resources quickly, fast, and ship it out. They don't care about any other thing along that pipeline, So, and it's the same thing if they come later on and say they want to improve agriculture, or with their green revolution, they are going to do what favors the big agriculture, which means a lot of inputs, costly inputs. You're buying seeds, you're buying, a lot of inputs that you're putting into your agriculture or your farming process, which makes the process a loss for peasants at the end of the day. When you look at the killing off of biodiversity and, the inputs that you're putting and the debts that the farmers' financial burden it becomes. So to sum it up, it is not in their interest to advance agriculture for you and to rearrange it for you. And what they want is just to preserve that easy access, the cheapest, fastest, quickest way to get the resources out, and not educating your farmer or doing skill transfer or technology transfer. That's it.
Right. Yeah, Mega, how would you respond to that? Do you feel similarly that, in a sense, this was like keeping agriculture backward because of, like, but in effect, a policy to do that in order to maintain a competitive advantage? Or do you feel that the peasantry actually was able to hold its own, was kind of competitive enough that the colonial state just didn't feel like there was any need to further develop it? How would you respond to that? I know you like nuance, so.
Not necessarily.
Right.
Yeah, my first intervention, I said, this was, the marketing boards were actually essentially set up to serve British interests, all right, during the colonial period. That will change, or that changed further down the lines when these institutions were then handed over to the locals, nationalists, who then took over power from the colonialists. But at inception, I don't think it was. I don't think OEG gives these white guys a lot of credit. Let them think past that. These guys are morons, really, to be honest, to some extent.
Right.
I think that they had to balance their books in the metropoles. Okay, and to do so, they needed to exploit the peasants, right? It wasn't quite a question of technological transfer. That fight was happening in the West in terms of other Western powers had then become industrial powerhouses too. Like I mentioned also that by the 40s, America had already begun to flex its own muscle, probably later than, countries like Germany, France, and all of that. So it was more a case of making use of the colonies to advance your strength within, the world economic order or orbit. So, to that extent, I think that wasn't, OAG's intervention would be something that came much, much later,
right.
Just when they were about to pack their bags and leave. But essentially, they wanted to buy cheap from us and sell at the world market. So I think one point to make here is that in its first transition, there wasn't initially a cocoa marketing board or palm oil marketing board or granite pyramid marketing board. It was essentially a produce control board for the entire West Africa. Initially, this was in 1939, right? The cocoa marketing boards and all of these other iterations of it didn't manifest, until the mid 40s, right? And so, what these guys wanted to do was control the trade, which meant that they shut out sale of cocoa to America first. Okay, so all trade to America had to go through Britain, and go through Britain, maybe even as finished goods, from processing cocoa itself, or go through Britain. So they shut out American buyers. Meanwhile, America at the time were the biggest importers of cocoa, but they couldn't buy from the Nigerian colony, which was under, which was already subservient to the British, to Great Britain, as it were. So it was more about market
domination,
share, and domination, really, in its initial phase, right?
Yeah.
So
inter-imperial rivalry.
Yes, that's what set the stage. But then further down the road, they would then give all sorts of reason for this, which included industrialization, within the colonies. They also gave reasons of trying to balance price fluctuation. So because of the seasonality of produce in the world market, there are times when it's sold for high and there are times when it's sold for less. So if it sold for less, they wanted to use the surplus oil. They claimed that they were going to use the surplus that they got from selling from high to stabilize, so that the peasants, farmers didn't bear the brunt of low market price for those producers. But that all of that was bullshit anyway, as it turned out.
And another rationale was that they needed some money to do development, right? Because of course they weren't bringing money from outside of the colony largely. They were extracting money from within to do things like build roads to the ports or build ports or
even that was faced. Yes, there were times when they didn't bring in and there were times when they did bring in.
Right.
And but then sorry to cut you short, but even when they brought in, we would need to go find out whether they were bringing money that, from surplus. So it's not, they weren't doing us a favor. It's the point I'm making.
Sure, totally. No, but, the wider point being that development was another rationale that they had for trying to control revenue inflow and outflow, right? Through the marketing boards as well. The question I was trying to raise there, before we go further into the history, is around why the colonial state chose to extract from the existing productive system or the existing mode of production, so to speak, rather than to set up one that in theory would have been more efficient, at least according to a lot of people's perspective, right, on how agriculture works. Why didn't they think, oh, look, if we set up palm oil plantations or cocoa or rice plantations, that because
it's cheaper.
Consider
it's
this
cheaper.
fact, but consider this fact, OAG.
Yeah.
To collect produce from hundreds, perhaps hundreds of thousands of peasants requires an administrative system, which you're going to spend money on, right? Whereas to set up a plantation perhaps requires a little less of that administrative apparatus, even if the expense might be around quote unquote land clearance or labor costs and these sorts of things. But those expenses might be offloaded to a charter company or to merchants, some of whom were asking for plots of land to set up plantations. So, I mean, it's kind of a historical question as well as a theoretical one. And I mean, the cheapness might be part of it, but that will boil down to the exact numbers that were on the table, right? So, I mean, you partially answered it in OAG when you said that, look, there's a competitive advantage question that they don't necessarily want you to compete with value, like productive enterprises that actually are adding value in the metropole. But might there be other reasons why they circumvented the plantation system, which they set up in other places? Like in Sao Tome or wherever they were doing like sugar plantations, right? To focus on just taxing smallholders or taking surplus from smallholders here. What do you think?
I'm sure they will have made their own analysis. Again, there's a mentality that comes with exploitation. If you are having to do 1 or 2, 3, 4 levels to get your money, and at the end of the day, it's going to make your stuff smoother at the end of the day, you might not see that because you are currently just exploiting and your mind is in the moment. It's cheaper for you because of your short-sighted. That exploitation makes your view very short-sighted. And one, you're not here to transform anything. You're here to, okay, this is what we have on deck. This is what we're going to use. And let's use it, especially when the labor is not coming from you. When that labor is not coming from you, then it doesn't matter. Let them arrange if it's cheap labor, if it's free labor from slavery, anything, we'll just work with that and get what we can get after all. Because if we balance that input of labor and they're supposed to pay for the labor, then it will become more apparent that it's a loss. But if you're largely not paying for the labor, then to me, it's a sum total. It almost boils down to a sum gain because you're getting it without putting in any labor, any sort of inputs, but you're just buying it. So you sort of duck having to pay the real reflection of labor and what labor goes into it. And then again, they are not in the business of transforming your agricultural space or developmental anything for you. So let's just keep it that way. Let's get our resources and bounce. It's now left for you. If you have your national government, if you want to develop, that's left, if you have a revolutionary government that feels like, look, we can't be catering to outsiders and starving and selling cocoa, whatever, so that's another different ballgame. But to transform your economy or to make it advanced or to make it more efficient, I don't think they're in the business of doing that, so they will naturally not do it. Yeah.
Right. Any other additional thoughts on this, Emeka, as to because I hear OG to some extent, but on the other hand, colonial states set up plantations elsewhere. So, if you're saying it's kind of inherent to the logic of colonial state, it doesn't explain why they did it elsewhere. So
again, what they've met, like I said, what they've met in different places matters.
Sure.
It could be plantation system somewhere else, or they didn't have anything feasible. So it's now okay to set up a plantation. Okay, let's now make it a big effort. Then even if they set up that plantation, it will just be for plantation app, or it's not going to be advanced here.
Not to say that those plantations were necessarily technologically more advanced.
Exactly. So what they've met here is maybe peasant agriculture, and let's just plug our pipeline, that peasant agriculture, this thing, and export the resources. If they get to another place where the agricultural system is never they feasible, or they have to set up something from the scratch, or the population no reach, all that, then they might impute a bit of technology inside of it and then make it a bit more efficient to cover up for the gap of labor with so the variables they different based on what they meet on ground. So I feel the explanation for setting up plantation or the level of technological inputs they put in is dependent on what they've met on ground and what they feel is works for them at that point in time in that exploitative framework.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know. What I'm more conversant with, if you talk about history and from a sociological point of view, even though I think I'm biting into Said's own terrain now, is that so in places where they set up plantation in the Americas, South America, maybe even Latin America.
No, but in some of the islands here, like Sao Tome.
Yeah, so I don't want to speak to Sao Tome,
okay,
because I'm not very conversant with it, So except this ties into the framework that I'm trying to use, was that in the Americas, it was more. So let's not forget that slave trade, had happened.
They brought in the labor.
Yeah, they brought in the labor, and that it had to be forced in that sense. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Except maybe in Sao Tome, this then fits the bill for Sao Tome. I'm not sure, but
it does. They brought in the labor. Right. Too. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. But the sociology of events of people here in West Africa was reversed to that. So, in other words, you had people. Slave trade had been abolished, maybe a century before that.
Right.
The former slaves had started, some of them had started to make their way back home, places where they called or thought was home, and had taken up leadership positions, especially in colonies like Lagos, because Lagos used to be its own colony, at some point. And that, the advances that these guys were making in terms of nationalism, the fight for nationalism, was beginning to permeate into the hinterland. So they had problems peculiar to West Africa, that can't be generalized. And so that's one angle to look at it from. The second bit, that I'd stress is the fact that, I don't care who buys it, but these white guys weren't very smart, and part of the rationale for what they did was kind of knee-jerk, all right? It was also compounded by the fact that by the 1940s, when they had to then set, specifically for nation states, now Nigeria being one of them, when they had to then move from produce control boards, which was a West African initiative, to to regional marketing boards as they then became. The nationalist fervor, at the time had reached a crescendo. So that by 1947, when I suspect that the Cocoa Marketing Board was set up, India had already become independent.
Right.
So what's the point of throwing up that much energy into something that you are going to leave anyways? So, I think that it's a compilation of, or constellation of, different factors that needs to be interrogated.
Yeah.
It's not, this is a brilliant question, not just because it forces one to think about these things more broadly, but it's but it's essentially because it does force us to think about these things more broadly. But it's a nice question. It's something that one might need to go back, and find answers to within the existing literature. But for one, I think that slavery and the way that Nigerians reacted to it Because they even thought that at some point they thought that the abolition of slavery would have meant that migration would move more towards the coastal areas, where some semblance of development had started to, but that didn't happen because they thought that they would have filled up roles in the ports and harbors that they were building for workmen. But no, guys actually decided to go back into farming. I also think that there's an issue about land rights that we need to factor into that equation. The British never really took land off, in the West African area, and certainly not in Nigeria.
Not in large
they didn't. Yeah, they didn't own. So land predominantly was left in the hands of, if you like, these peasants, in the hands of households and family. And then to go against that grain would have been catastrophic because this wasn't the time for experimentation. They needed to move and then they moved.
Right. We should turn in a moment to independence, and the First Republic. Because we're already moving in that direction. But I think I want, your responses have clarified a lot to me about the origin of marketing boards as built on peasant agriculture rather than, desire to transform it in any other direction. I think there's maybe one other factor that I would throw into the mix that is a tricky one for socialists to contend with. And it's kind of emerges from the point you were making, Emeka, just at the end there about land and the question of labor as well. And it might be that actually peasant agriculture in this part of the world might have been seen as probably more efficient actually than other forms, than kind of large-scale state-run plantation agriculture or even private agriculture, partially because the availability of land means that it's going to be hard to convince people to leave their own plot and come and work on your plot, right?
That became a problem later, actually. Yeah.
Right, which is part of why, like, appeals by merchant capitalists to the colonial state, like British merchants who wanted to come and set up plantations in West Africa were actually often denied because the colonial state is like, we don't want to go to the trouble of having to find labor for you or having to police laborers.
The poorly of their land, so just come plug into it.
Exactly. Like, like the apartheid state, for instance, in Southern Africa, spends a lot of administrative energy on policing the movement of laborers, right?
Yeah, and even importing labor from other Southern African countries.
Exactly. So it starts to seem like capitalist agriculture in Africa. I mean,
Zimbabwean farmers.
Right.
Yeah, Zimbabwean farmers. Yeah, Mozambique.
Right. Yeah, but nice one if I can call back to but I mean, like, it's starting to seem like, and this is something the colonial state was already recognizing, that large-scale plantation or capitalist agriculture requires an enormous amount of state investment, where the existing
logistics, a lot of things,
and so then it ends up being that these institutions are sustained by constant revenue, constant inflows from the state, and they're producing goods much more expensively because of all the inputs and such that which he was describing, and then having to sell them when the prices are fluctuating. Whereas peasants are producing cheaply, relatively speaking, often through utilizing family labor, and are actually quite a bit more in tune with the land and the seasons, and so ultimately, on balance, might have been deemed to be more efficient than large-scale agriculture, which raises a very interesting question for socialists, right? Because socialists have often thought about, I mean, certainly in Africa, but I'd say across the third world, these collective projects or these large-scale plantation projects as the kind of next stage. I mean, of course, the Soviet collectivist experiments were also kind of unfortunate, let's say, example of this, or shining example, depending where you sit. But I think this flies in the face of that to some extent, because it suggests that maybe the next stage is actually worse than the current stage if you see peasant agriculture as perhaps much more efficient than the kind of larger scale collectivizing or plantation style agriculture. OG, have I sufficiently pissed you off? That's part of what I'm trying to do here. Or do you buy certain aspects of this? Because if, in effect, I'm saying that the peasants might not be backwards after all. That it may be that they are actually the best producers, given the land they're dealing with and given the market conditions they're dealing with here. Thoughts? Yeah, and this is something that the colonial state perhaps even was the first to recognize.
I feel you've kind of answered the question the earlier part. Yeah. I feel in the earlier parts, looking at the logistics and what to do, I'm thinking about labor, all that. They figured out, let's just work with what's on ground and plug into it. However, there is always room for development and advancement of your agricultural methods and ways of doing it. There are more efficient ways of planting, agroecology don't they? There are different things and methods of, ways, inputs, using machinery, improving units, of harvest or whatever per acre is something that we should look into, So with the advancement of technology, it is the right application of those technologies into agriculture that will not damage the biodiversity, that will not damage the land, and that will look after the farmer and the well-being of everybody involved in the agricultural process. That's what we call a complete package of...
Are you saying that this can't happen within the peasants?
Yeah, because is best place to assess.
I'm not saying that we can't do that in the peasant agricultural methodology of doing things. I'm just saying that there might be better ways. That's not why you get R&D. That's not why we get, let's just keep the agricultural process or procedures. Let's keep it as effective or efficient as we can, making sure that there's more yield for the farmer and we are not damaging the environment, because with the evolution of agriculture, as we see further down the line, we've seen that monocultures don't come, shifting culture, a lot of bad practices don't come.
Yes, which is what the plantations tend to do anyway, right?
Exactly. So which are things where we say in the long run, if they damage biodiversity, they damage the ability of the land to recover from the agricultural processes, the new and modernized one, So, and it is based on that class difference, that antagonistic relationship between the plantationist and all this, peasant farmer go know how to handle in land. Go know say, okay, make I not stress this portion, make I use this portion, make I divide them. When I know they use this portion, make I put my goat on top and make I make rotation agriculture, But waiting concerning plantation, you won't farm one time, you won't strip the topsoil one time, you won't use chemical one time. You don't care waiting the chemical they do to your underground water reserves. You don't care if diseases they come. So all these kind of things, it is very, very tough. So we are supposed to advance agriculture in conjunction with peasant farmers and making sure that what we are doing is carrying them along, and we don't do research and making sure you go with waiting favor them and the environment ultimately. So in having colonialists come in and do that, with all the things we are done list, it's not going to happen because they're not going to factor in all those social and environmental aspects. If not, look at all the places where they have mine gold or crude oil, all this kind of, look what's into the environment. And a lot of, like India too, they complain so much about, destruction of the environment or farming deaths, farmers, they enter debts, they commit suicide or they die by suicide. So there are a lot of factors to consider. And to answer Emeka, better agriculture can happen, in conjunction with the peasants. So, if we get the states where they listen to the peasants, where they do research and tap into local knowledge, then we can advance farming, So that's it.
Maybe you want to add anything before we shift to the First Republic, which in many ways is the exact opposite of the kind of states that OVG was describing.
Yeah, but I think that we'll get more from shifting into the First Republic, because some of these problems then, like you're mentioning, then rears its ugly head. But
right.
So I think that I hear Weiji and that there is no conflict here.
No, sure.
The person I have a conflict with is you, Saeed, because I don't understand when you say that the colonial government, maybe they had the foresight or they saw the future and then understood that peasantry. They don't see any foresight. They just do say them. No, they accord these people. Anyway, I'm joking.
No. Yeah, I mean, but this is coming from an actual, historical source where a British investor, let's call him that,
Sabinus,
was seeking to set up a plantation, right? So this is Governor Clifford, right? In fact, I think under Clifford that this conversation happened. It's actually
Clifford was one of the better ones,
right? It was Unilever that, in one instance, was trying to set up a plantation, and then there's another example: Temple and Gerard. These people had come to set up plantations, or petition or made requests from the colonial government. And the colonial government, actually had a very interesting response. To read aspects of the Clifford statement, this is in 1920. Agricultural industries in tropical countries which are in the hands of the native peasantry, A, have a firmer root than similar enterprises when owned and managed by Europeans because they are natural growths, not artificial creations. B, are incomparably the cheapest instruments for the production of agriculture.
Cheapest.
To OG's point, on a large scale that have been devised. And C, are capable of rapidity of expansion and increase of output that beggar
every
past. Say again?
Is that Bob?
Governor Clifford, I don't know who was his first name.
No, I mean the person who's giving this account.
Okay, no, this is cited in Gavin Williams.
Oh, Gavin Williams. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So then this conclusion that actually plantations were not needed to produce taxable export crops because the peasants were already doing so fairly effectively. And the idea was that, look, it turns out peasants are actually better rooted and more efficient than Unilever, who, would have required all these government inputs, and suddenly the colonial state would have found itself to basically be responding constantly to requests from, it would have been the kind of Zimbabwean farmer situation where you have to keep giving them credit, water. If there's no sunlight, they will come to you. You need to police all this stuff, right? So in saying the colonial state,
don't come too much, they're going to need swimming
pool. They're going to need swimming pool. Yeah. So basically, in saying that the colonial state had that foresight, it's just to say that they recognize something, which, by the way, the Nigerian government,
Clifford
at least, Clifford, contemporary period seems to have forgotten, which is that capitalist agriculture in these parts of the world, and maybe everywhere, is like much more expensive than it's worth. So you just have to decide that that's what you want to spend money on, and then pretend that you're making profit at the end. Because in practice, actually, peasants are much more efficient. Which you could argue is something that the First Republic recognized, right? Because the governments of the First Republic, that's the regional governments, basically adopted these institutions. And again, a lot of Nigerians will be familiar with the rosy aspect of this picture. They will think about the way in which you had these pictures of granite pyramids waiting to be exported in the north, and you had cocoa that was generating enough revenue for Action Group to be running elections and building universities, and also building the tallest building in West Africa or whatever, Cocoa House in Ibadan. And you had palm oil, supporting quite an expansive development agenda in the Southeast at the time as well. So, people will remember that aspect. But what they forget is that this was built on the back of peasants who were not receiving those resources, right? Because, that cocoa, that palm oil, those granules were being sold for dollars in the world economy. And then rather than transfer those resources directly to the peasantry, they were going in all these other directions. So, is there more to add there in terms of the history, or how would you guys react to the fact that, in effect, the First Republic leaders, the independence leaders, just inherited those institutions without making them any more accountable to the peasants, or, without actually improving the nature of the productive process that we've been discussing.
And it just goes to show that the class relations, although if you don't enter, you might have entered the hands of Africans, but that class relations wasn't resolved, like the antagonistic class relations between who they produce and who they enjoy the benefits or the proceeds of the produce.
Right.
It wasn't resolved, so exploitation just continued.
Mm-hmm.
So it continued, and the farmers would not see too much, the peasants themselves will not see too much of the material benefit or gain, even with the nationalist government in charge, So that's what I see it as. Like, it's just a simple summary.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's my take, quickly. I hope it's quick though. But
he's even hoping he's there, bro.
I think that at the turn of independence, right? I think that a bit of that model, all out peasantry, was tweaked a bit.
Okay.
So commercial farms, didn't come out of thin air, and I'd say that they started.
So they started to spring up here in the first.
Yeah, around that time, and that at the heart of this was that the colonial government then decided to empower, because so we talk about these things within communities, and so for the average Nigerian who thinks about it today, if you take cashew, for instance, which I'm a bit more conversant with, you would locate it within communities, yes, across Nigeria, but within specific local governments, and then within communities in specific local governments, which meant that there were social relationships that had already existed, prior to that time. So what had happened by the time, our own people took over, was that they then used the marketing boards as a tool for expanding political patronage, in ways that then gave rise to commercial farmers who amassed loads of wealth, but could also influence farmers within their own within their own community. But that then also skewed things, and made administration or even organizing the peasant workforce even more cumbersome, but also effectively made it more difficult for socialists to in effect
make a case for
wrestle power from them, using the peasantry.
Right.
I think I was mentioning to Said the other day that this would be a good time to hear what folks like Ebin Madnagu and Biodu Jaifo and that cohort, of radical Marxists tried to do in a place called Ode Omu, along the Ife axis, in terms of organizing, and then these guys were spoiling for a revolution, but that's, talk for another time. But why one wants to learn of these things, firsthand from their own account would be to see what kinds of challenges that they faced.
Sure.
Because these networks were so expansive that they also began, in the case of, well-established commercial farmers, co-opt even the poorer peasants.
Right.
And then it's probably a good time to note that peasants don't necessarily mean that they were all poor. So you also have rich peasants, and this is something that what's his name now? Beckman, points out in one of his works. So it's it's a complex situation, and I think that part of, I might be short for saying this, but part of the reason why the left in Nigeria has struggled with trying to fashion out, really smart ways to go around this problem is that we don't have. I get the sense. I often get the sense, apart from very few people, of which people like Badi Onimode belongs in that league. There are very few socialists or leftists who really understand the capitalist psyche,
right?
And you can get into the psyche enough to be able to turn things around from ground, even with stealth. So it's always just this. Let's lump them together and then criticize them. Let's lump them together. And then those little things that, you can push to your favor, you then miss them out. So the point that I'm trying to make is that it was tweaked when, our own people took over, and it got better because they understood the mentality of the people that they were dealing with. All right. So when OAG makes the case for peasant farming getting better, sometimes they set out to do these things. But because of the way that they introduced commercial farming into the matrix and the way it was, so, and this is something that Said often says, so even when it comes to sharing inputs, this is pre-planting, during the planting season, these inputs usually go to the commercial farmers, like the bulk of it.
So, but that's the thing. I mean, when you say it was tweaked and improved, I mean, I think it's crucial to affirm what you did mention, but which is that it was where there was like advancements, if you want to call it that. That
it was tweaked and improved to whose favor?
Exactly. It was really like upper level team members and family members we're talking about.
No, I'm not making the case that it was tweaked for the peasants. So
no, sure. Get me wrong. That's it, right?
I'm not making. No. I'm not making.
Otherwise, we wouldn't have had,
or rather, for the poor piece, for the poor
peasants, and those kinds of. Literally votes against early independence taxation.
Yes, but you see, the truth of the matter was that even the commercial farmers, the birth of the commercial farmers, which was largely propped up by patronage networks that politicians had to build using funds from marketing boards, was to attract their own pool of supporters, even among the farming communities, even within the peasant.
Right.
Okay? And the guys who became rich were the appointsmen within peasant communities, who then shared, what was supposed to go to the whole peasantry to party people.
And also, so the guys also the traders, the people who were in between, as in, the people who were
middlemen.
The people who were supposedly working for marketing boards, those people also got. Because
the middleman, which is the irony, because part of the reasons why the marketing boards were introduced initially was to eliminate the middleman, right?
Yeah.
But you see, if we even begin to go into traders, then we won't blow this thing out of the water, because it got so bad, that having been shortchanged through price fixing, price exploitation, you then had a situation which still persists to today, especially when you talk about cash crops, for exports. But all sorts of farming, even with subsistence farming, my brothers, is that you then had a situation where, because they were being shortchanged at the farm gate, right? It meant that farming wasn't even profitable, and this is something that Gavin Williams goes into, so that by 1985, when Gavin Williams was already writing about marketing boards, how did he go? Marketing with or without marketing boards, or marketing with or without boards, right? He was already talking about the death of cash crop farming, because he wasn't paying, so big industries, local buying agents, traders, multinationals were making a trunk load of money, and the farmers who were the main producers of these things were living in penury.
Well, so this goes to OAG's point about short-sighted exploitation. Like, the thing became exploitative to the point where it could not even be sustained anymore. So these people then started to shift from producing cash crops to food crops, which maybe in the long run was good, because then it increased food self-sufficiency in the Nigerian economy. If you think that's a good thing, it's debatable. But, it goes to the point about this thing being ultimately quite a short-sighted thing. And that's the real secret, or that's one of the secret reasons why it failed, which is what we should go on to before we end. So when people look nostalgically at groundnut pyramids and stuff, they often forget that it's not just the end of the regional system that meant the end of that form of the economy that was agriculture based. It's also the fact that the regional system exploited that agricultural economy to the point where it was forced to go out of business. So the notion that regionalization will supercharge,
will be some kind of El Dorado.
Yes, the economy more productive is nonsensical. It's the productive economy that powered regionalization. It's not regionalization that created a productive economy. And when regionalization had eaten its own tail, it collapsed.
It was always set up to fail. From the colonial period, you know. So by the time these guys took over power, it was. They kind of accelerated it.
They did
in the ways that
because they were busy building the tallest building in West Africa.
Yeah, in the ways that they put it to use, right? Which is why. Also, and this is another part of the argument for why it failed, which always brings oil into the mix. But it'll be nice for people to realize that cocoa, which had more staying power, which stayed for a bit longer, by the 70s, right, was dead
in the world market, right?
Yeah. By even and that then took its toll on Nigeria. But that's always conflicted with the fact that it coincides with the rise of or the discovery of oil. Now, but what doesn't coincide with the discovery of oil, especially because it was in the region where oil was actually even discovered, is the one for palm produce. So by the 60s, right, even before the Biafran War, because there are also people who say, that the Biafran War also helped accelerate, the death of the palm oil industry in southeastern Nigeria, which comprised the South at the time. No, even Emile Okpara's experiment, which was an adoption or a copycat of the Israeli system, was already on its dying leg by 1966. So again, Said, thanks. You raise points and questions that force us to go back and do some work about, political economy and not, fall into that trap of mounting off free education. Free education. Our family Amolo is the greatest thing that happens since big things. That's a whole lot of claptrap. Really? Thanks.
I certainly think so too. And so you pointed to some of the factors that led to some additional factors that led to the decline there, including the collapse of the world price of a lot of these commodities, in the midst of global economic crisis in the 70s, which is also, goes to the point you were all raising, that we can't talk about the foresight of the colonial state when it was built on primary commodities, which are volatile. And then you also talk about the rise of oil, which I think we won't delve into too much this time, but which surely is often read backwards, right? So because the point you make is that the arrival of oil kind of bailed Nigeria out. It's not that oil arrived.
Nice are behind, man.
It's not that oil arrived and then people forgot about groundnut pyramids. Is that the groundnut was worthless, and that's why that's why it was sitting there in pyramids.
That transition, yeah,
because it couldn't actually. There was no demand for it. Demand had collapsed on the world market. So had oil not arrived, I mean, we would have been stuck. In an economic crisis, which happened anyway, but at least oil delayed it, you could argue. So then my final question when it comes to this question of marketing boards concerns the left. And, Emeka was going in this direction already. But it seems like a lot of the left during that period slightly fetishized the marketing boards or believed that, look, if we seize power, we could use the marketing boards for something better than what they're being used for. I think the model of using the surplus to do free education in the Southwest probably bamboozled some people. But they also saw the marketing boards as the kind of state institution that can direct the economy, right? So, of course, for certain kinds of leftists, that's quite attractive. A lot of what we read to think about this period in history was very critical of that kind of leftism. I wonder where you guys sit on that question. Like, is there a use for institutions like this that might set prices for agricultural commodities, might quote unquote market agricultural commodities on behalf of the peasantry or on behalf of indigenous producers? Or do you feel like these kinds of institutions have no place? And here's what's very interesting about this issue is that the critics of marketing boards from the left found that they actually were saying very similar things to neoliberals, which were emerging in the 80s, and also demanding that these marketing boards be abolished, right, as part of the structural adjustment process. In fact, structural adjustment is what ended up abolishing the marketing board. So if you disagree with those leftists who were saying that marketing boards could be used for something progressive, then just bear in mind that that might force you to agree with the neoliberals. But anyway, I wonder how you guys would
Are you sure? Should we complicate this a bit more?
Go for it.
This is an interesting one, and please remind me in case I forget, because it's something that we might have to flesh out more outside the time allotted for this bit, right? So from where I stand, and this comes to me because I'm sort of like a player in these things, nowadays. And then the way I think about it is, so when you talk about agribusiness today, which is a term that resonates more in the modern age,
more contemporary.
And then you talk about startups, which is something that's become, the go-to terminology used by, if you like, I don't want to even say neoliberals and say, what do you call those people?
Let's call them investors.
The neoclassical economists and all of that. So I mean, startups in that sense, right, are doing what marketing boards used to do.
Right. Right.
So, right. So, and they don't have a choice. So it's not a question of they want to deal with commercial farmers, not especially in a country like Nigeria. 70 to 80% of the food produced in this country, whether, in terms as from subsistence farming or as a result of farming, cash crops, are produced by peasant farmers.
Mm-hmm.
Peasant farmers between the poor and the old. Now, 20% is what's produced by commercial farmers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That can't even service any markets. Whether you're exporting commodities, be that sesame seeds or cashew nuts or hibiscus flowers, whatever the case is, soybeans and all of that. So what do these guys do? They've gone back, in my own opinion, and I might be wrong, they've gone back to the marketing board model.
Yeah. But they're not state-owned. And I mean, that's where the question arises.
Okay.
I hear where you're coming from. That, like, okay. people who set up monopolies. I mean, setting up monopolies is every capitalist's dream because, of course, capitalists actually want to be aristocrat. They want to be feudal. They don't actually want to be engaging in buying and selling. They want to just be able to be collecting money. Everybody wants to be done, right? Where the state pays you, you have dominant market share, so you determine price. So it's not about competing or innovating or all this nonsense, right? So
Dangote model.
No, but Said, hear me out. I wasn't even done, right? I'm just saying.
So I don't want to dwell too much on the entrepreneurial marketing boards that exist, which people call startups. I mean, I think it's very nice that you raised that, but I want
the point I was. No, but you're shutting me down because the point I wanted to make wasn't about the entrepreneurial side of it. It was what they used it to do in terms of how the relationship that they then established with peasant farms, which if the marketing boards did effectively, that there might have been a case for it. So what do these guys do? They make sure, so it's some kind of aggregating scheme, where they have peasant farmers within their network. The reason why they do that is while they buy the produce off these guys, after harvest, right? They also extend certain kinds of services. So where you might talk about it in the capitalist sense, but what they do is that they make access to inputs. They grant farmers access to inputs. Some of them are already beginning to take on the problem of debt, which middlemen and traders. That practice that middlemen and traders profit from. Yeah. So it will interest you to know that tendency of traders advancing money to farmers
for next year's harvest.
That started from the era of the marketing, but still, is in practice.
Yeah, of course.
Today. And it's an exploitative relationship. So, but some of these startups, who even have humane faces, are doing this bit of, making credit available to these guys. We also know that
that's very interesting. I mean, I'm going to have to cut you off because of time. But all right. It kind of sounds like you're saying, to put it provocatively, that the left can learn a lot from neoliberals if we want to do marketing boards.
I'm even saying that depending on who was making the arguments at the time, I'm saying that neoliberals have even learned from some leftists who were more clear-eyed about
the use of marketing boards.
Yeah, of marketing boards in their critique of.
But again, remember that these leftists were talking about the use of marketing boards by the state, so they weren't talking about setting up entrepreneurial enterprises, which brings
I agree.
Back up,
right?
I agree. For OEG, which is like, say the revolution happens. Do you think that, it makes sense to set up institutions that can set prices of agricultural produce and do like collective marketing for the peasantry? Or do you think it's about allowing a kind of, so to speak, market socialist system set prices for the... I mean, it's a huge question, I'm aware, but I guess I wonder how you respond to these state institutions that did exist and now exist in the private economy. Like, how should socialists think about these kinds of institutions that exist kind of to create monopoly conditions, either supposedly in the interest of the peasantry or in the case of the entrepreneurs to do things more efficiently?
What I think is it's the nature of the states and the character of the state that will determine if these marketing boards will be some sort of fair representation and like sort of just compensations for the farmers. That's social organization and interaction between farmer and the state and the type of economic basis which organizes things matters. Because socialism or socialist construction are projects. We can go ahead and use the marketing board. We say, okay, truly, fairly compensate farmers. How well can we now twist it? Should we let the farmers have like a bigger say, or should we look at the cost of, should we look at the cost of taking it out, put the state input, and then what we want to do, how to fix the price, So to me, socialism is not a fixed way of saying something there. It is that constant yearning towards egalitarian or fair relationship in society, because I don't put my labor inside something. This is not the cost of how to, from farm to fork or from farm to sheep, whatever. What goes into it? What will be a fair justification for the farmer, and the peasants? Are we going to organize the peasants in a much more, like coherent organization where we say they go fit tell us what they want, then the states go factor them out, sample them, okay, this is this, let's come to an agreement as to this year, this now the amount we go into the process. This is what you'll be compensated per acreage or per hectare. These kind of things. It's not straightforward, because I don't want to say the way it is. But if the state is honest and considers genuinely, the interest of the farmers, then it will constantly be open to rearranging or editing what sort of organization, no matter what we want to call them, if we call them marketing, but if we call them anything. Yeah. But just make sure that the farmers or the peasants or the people that are putting in the labor are getting a fair share or a reasonable share, as to the benefits that they're supposed to be getting, So that's it for me.
So I mean, you may not be too far from America if I was hearing him as saying that, in a sense, it's not that the institution itself is doomed, but it's just the use you put it to.
Exactly.
Kind of thing.
If you get cutlass, who's an cut person here? If you get cutlass, who's an clear fan?
Or the person who wields it.
Exactly. And what is it like?
In whose interest are you marketing?
In whose interest are you marketing? Yeah, So
on my own issue.
And what goes into the thing, the product or the produce, you go analyze all those ones and then be in charge of, representing it properly for the farmers,
But okay, to conclude, I guess my own issue with institutions like marketing boards is that, like, the thing is that no revolution will change society root and branch. You go still get people where they prefer the previous system.
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely. And even within the party hierarchy, not even to talk of the bureaucratic machinery of the state, those people go there. We go still.
There'll be resistance to change.
So then if you bring about those institutions, the existence of capitalist opposition within society, which you cannot totally extend, probably shouldn't totally extend, will mean that there's always a risk that people within and outside of the state will use those institutions for a kind of exploitation that even the market cannot always match. Do you know what I mean? Like, it creates the possibility of a super exploitation that even the market.
There's no way we're going to wipe out a lot of all these tendencies within a decade, 2 decades. Even for some countries where they proclaim socialist or whatever, there's still capitalist relations. There's still, go change. But as long as there's that constant yearning and constant pushing, I'm fine with it.
Right.
I'm fine with it. It won't change overnight. But the state must be seen clearly and unambiguously to be on the side of the people and the people that are doing the work. That's my justification for say something there on its way to being socialist. Right. If we are using the state model. Yeah. If not be like Chiapas for Mexico or whatever.
Yeah, man. So, which is also something that we should maybe consider at another point, is like, what are the kind of non-state models of socialized production? But that's a different conversation for another day, because I think we've probably exhausted this conversation for today.